British Airways Flight 287 from London to Manchester was settling into its routine when the atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted dramatically. It was Tuesday afternoon, and most passengers had already found their seats, stowed their belongings, and begun the familiar ritual of preparing for takeoff. The gentle hum of conversation and the rustle of newspapers created the typical ambience of a domestic flight, until Lysander Pemberton stepped aboard. At 52, Lysander Pemberton was worth approximately £2.8 billion, a fortune built through aggressive property development and strategic investments that had made him one of Britain's most recognizable businessmen. His name appeared regularly in the financial press, usually accompanied by stories of hostile takeovers, massive development projects, and the kind of ruthless business practices that had earned him both immense wealth and an equally impressive collection of enemies. Physically, Lysander cut an imposing figure. Tall and impeccably dressed in a bespoke Savile Row suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word "no" applied to anything he wanted. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, caught the cabin lights as he gestured dismissively at the flight attendant who approached to greet him. "This seat is unacceptable," he announced before Araminta Blackthorne could even finish her welcoming smile. His voice carried the kind of authority that was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The leather appears to have been cleaned inadequately, and I specifically requested the forwardmost seat in first class." Araminta, a 29-year-old flight attendant with 5 years of experience dealing with difficult passengers, maintained her professional composure despite the immediate hostility. She was petite and elegant, with auburn hair pulled back in the regulation style and a smile that had weathered countless challenging situations. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture perfect, and her voice remained steady as she responded. "I do apologize, Mr. Pemberton," she said, consulting her tablet. "This is indeed the seat we have reserved for you, and I can assure you that all of our first-class accommodations are cleaned to the highest standards. Would you like me to see if there's anything specific I can do to make you more comfortable?" Lysander's expression suggested that her very existence was making him uncomfortable. "What I would like is for you to understand that I didn't become successful by accepting substandard service. Where is the champagne that should have been offered the moment I stepped aboard? Where is the selection of newspapers? Do you people not understand basic hospitality?" The other first-class passengers were beginning to take notice of the commotion. An elderly gentleman with a walking stick, later identified as Barnaby Crumpwell, looked up from his book with obvious concern. A young mother, Seraphina Wickham, instinctively pulled her 5-year-old son Crispin closer to her, sensing the tension that was building in the cabin. But it was the tall figure seated 3 rows behind Lysander who observed the interaction with particular interest. Tyson Fury had boarded quietly, wearing casual clothes and hoping to travel without the usual fanfare that accompanied his public appearances. At 6 feet 9 inches, it was impossible for him to be truly inconspicuous, but he had developed a talent for keeping a low profile when he chose to. He wore simple jeans, a plain navy jumper, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Araminta returned with a glass of champagne and a selection of newspapers, her smile never wavering despite Lysander's continued complaints. "Here you are, Mr. Pemberton. Dom Perignon 2012, and today's Financial Times, Telegraph and Guardian." Lysander accepted the offerings without acknowledgement, examining the champagne glass as if he expected to find fingerprints or smudges. "This glass is spotted," he declared, though to everyone else it appeared perfectly clean, "and the champagne is insufficiently chilled. Do you people receive any training at all, or do they simply hire anyone off the street these days?" The insult hung in the air like toxic smoke. Araminta's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the hurt beneath before she quickly recovered. "I'll get you a fresh glass immediately, sir. See that you do, and while you're at it, perhaps you could arrange for someone with actual competence to serve this cabin. You clearly haven't been trained adequately for first-class service. People like you should understand your place in the service industry." The words "people like you" carried an unmistakable edge of class-based contempt that made several passengers visibly uncomfortable. Seraphina whispered something to her son, who was staring at Lysander with the wide-eyed fascination that children often showed when witnessing adult behavior they didn't understand. Barnaby Crumpwell cleared his throat softly, a sound that in earlier times might have indicated disapproval, but Lysander was far too self-absorbed to notice such subtle social cues. He was busy scrolling through his phone, checking share prices and firing off emails to subordinates, with the same dismissive arrogance he had shown to Araminta. It was then that Tyson Fury made his decision. He had been content to remain anonymous, to let the flight pass quietly while he mentally prepared for a meeting in Manchester. But watching a working woman being treated with such casual cruelty reminded him of his own humble origins, of his mother working multiple jobs to support their family, of the countless decent people he had met who deserved basic respect, regardless of their position in society's hierarchy. Tyson rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his imposing frame unfolding to its full height. The movement was deliberate but not aggressive, commanding attention through presence rather than hostility. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps silent on the aircraft's carpeted floor. "Excuse me, mate," Tyson said, his voice carrying a Mancunian accent that was deliberately calm and measured. "I couldn't help but notice you seem to be having some difficulty with the service. Perhaps I could help clarify a few things." Lysander looked up from his phone with the expression of someone unused to being interrupted by strangers. His eyes traveled up Tyson's considerable height, taking in the casual clothes and working-class accent, and his face settled into a sneer of aristocratic disdain. "And who exactly are you to involve yourself in my conversation with the staff?" Lysander's voice dripped with the kind of condescension that suggested he had already categorized Tyson as someone beneath his notice. "This is first class, not some public house where strangers insert themselves into private discussions." Tyson smiled slightly, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that suggested genuine amusement rather than confrontation. "Well, since you asked, I'm just someone who believes that treating people with basic decency shouldn't depend on their job title or bank balance." The response seemed to infuriate Lysander, who was clearly unaccustomed to having his behavior questioned by anyone, let alone someone he perceived as socially inferior. "I see. Another self-appointed champion of the working class, no doubt. Let me guess. You're probably some trade union organizer or construction worker who thinks his opinion matters in conversations between his betters." The casual cruelty of the words sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Serafina actually gasped audibly, while Barnaby's knuckles whitened as he gripped his walking stick more tightly. Even other passengers in the economy section, who could hear the raised voices through the cabin divider, began to pay attention to what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation. But Tyson's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of rising to the bait, instead of allowing himself to be provoked into the kind of angry confrontation that Lysander seemed to be inviting, he simply nodded thoughtfully. "You know what, mate?" he said, his voice remaining perfectly calm. "You're absolutely right about one thing. I am working class and proud of it, but I think you might be confused about something else." "And what might that be?" Lysander asked with theatrical impatience. "You seem to think that your money makes you better than everyone else on this aircraft, but what I've observed in the last 10 minutes suggests exactly the opposite." The words were delivered without malice, almost conversationally, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. Lysander's face flushed red as he realized that he was being called out publicly by someone who refused to be intimidated by his wealth or status. "How dare you?" he sputtered, his composure finally cracking. "You have no idea who you're speaking to. I could buy and sell people like you 1,000 times over." "I'm sure you could," Tyson agreed equably. "But here's the thing about respect, mate. It can't be bought. It has to be earned. And right now, that young lady doing her job professionally despite your rudeness has earned more respect from everyone on this aircraft than all your billions could ever purchase." The truth of the statement was evident in the faces of the other passengers, who were now openly watching the confrontation with expressions that ranged from fascination to outright approval. Araminta herself stood frozen near the galley, torn between her professional obligation to remain neutral and her obvious gratitude for someone finally standing up to the abuse she had been enduring. Lysander seemed to realize that the dynamics of the situation had shifted dramatically. What had begun as his opportunity to establish dominance over the service staff had somehow transformed into a public examination of his character, and he was clearly losing the contest in the court of public opinion. "This is outrageous," he declared, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the captain immediately. You'll be removed from this aircraft for threatening a fellow passenger." Tyson raised his eyebrows in genuine surprise. "Threatening? Mate, if you consider a polite conversation about basic manners to be threatening, you might want to examine why that makes you so uncomfortable." But before Lysander could respond, the aircraft's public address system crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin with the standard pre-flight announcements. The timing was fortuitous, creating a natural pause in the confrontation that allowed everyone to take a breath and reassess the situation. As the safety demonstration began, Tyson returned to his seat, leaving Lysander to stew in his embarrassment and anger. But the tension in the cabin remained palpable, and every passenger understood that this was only the beginning of what promised to be a very memorable flight. Araminta went about her duties with professional efficiency, but there was a subtle change in her bearing, a confidence that hadn't been there before someone had finally stood up for her dignity. And in the back of everyone's mind was the same question: what would happen when the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the confrontation inevitably resumed? 20 minutes into the flight, as the aircraft leveled off at 35,000 feet and the seatbelt sign dimmed, Lysander Pemberton had worked himself into a state of barely contained fury. He had spent the entire takeoff staring at the back of Tyson Fury's head, mentally composing the complaint letter he would write to British Airways management, the lawsuit he would file for harassment, and the various ways he would use his considerable influence to make life difficult for the presumptuous stranger who had dared to challenge him. But what truly rankled Lysander was the growing awareness that his fellow passengers were no longer looking at him with the mixture of envy and deference he was accustomed to receiving. Instead, their glances carried something much worse: pity, disappointment, and in some cases, outright contempt. For a man whose entire sense of self-worth was built on commanding respect through intimidation and wealth, this shift in perception was intolerable. The catalyst for the next phase of the confrontation came from an unexpected source. Barnaby Crumpwell, the 74-year-old gentleman with the walking stick, had been struggling since takeoff with the cramped conditions of his seat. Despite having paid for a first-class ticket, his arthritic joints made even the premium accommodations challenging to navigate. His medication had begun to wear off, and the combination of altitude changes and stress from witnessing Lysander's earlier behavior had left him feeling dizzy and disoriented. As Barnaby attempted to make his way to the lavatory, his walking stick caught momentarily on the leg of Lysander's seat. The elderly man stumbled slightly, catching himself against the armrest, but inadvertently jostling Lysander's champagne glass in the process. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. "For God's sake," Lysander roared, jumping to his feet as a few drops of champagne splashed onto his expensive trousers. "Can't you watch where you're going, you doddering old fool?" Barnaby, already unsteady on his feet, took a step backward and nearly lost his balance entirely. His face went pale and his hands began to shake visibly as he gripped his walking stick for support. I'm terribly sorry," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to—" "My walking stick got caught." But Lysander was beyond rational thought, his earlier humiliation now finding a target in someone even more vulnerable than the flight attendant. "Sorry doesn't clean $3,000 trousers, does it? Look at you. You can barely stand upright. You should be in a care home, not stumbling around an aircraft bothering people who can actually afford to be here." The cruelty of the attack left the entire cabin in stunned silence. This wasn't just rudeness. It was genuine cruelty directed at someone who posed no threat and had done nothing more than accidentally bump into a seat while trying to navigate with a mobility aid. Seraphina Wickham instinctively covered her son Crispin's ears, but the 5-year-old had already heard enough to begin crying softly. The child's sobs seemed to pierce through the aircraft's ambient noise, creating a soundtrack of innocence wounded by unnecessary adult cruelty. Araminta moved quickly to assist Barnaby, her training kicking in as she recognized the signs of someone having a medical episode. "Mr. Crumpwell, please sit down," she said gently, guiding him toward the nearest seat. "Let me get you some water." But Lysander wasn't finished. The sight of the flight attendant he had earlier berated, now showing kindness to someone else, seemed to trigger another wave of narcissistic rage. "And you!" he snapped at Araminta. "Instead of coddling every decrepit passenger on this aircraft, perhaps you could focus on doing something about the damage to my clothing. Do you have any idea what these trousers cost? Of course you don't. People in your position could never afford to understand real quality." The second attack on Araminta, coming so soon after his assault on Barnaby, seemed to break something in the collective patience of the other passengers. But it was Tyson Fury's response that would be remembered long after the flight had ended. Instead of standing up aggressively or launching into an angry confrontation, Tyson did something completely unexpected. He quietly unbuckled his seatbelt, rose from his seat, and walked over to where Barnaby was sitting, still shaking from the verbal assault. Ignoring Lysander entirely, Tyson knelt beside the elderly gentleman's seat, bringing his imposing frame down to eye level with the shaken man. "Mr. Crumpwell, isn't it?" Tyson said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority he had used when confronting Lysander. "I heard the young lady call you that. Are you feeling all right, sir? You look a bit pale." Barnaby looked up at this giant of a man who was speaking to him with such unexpected gentleness. Yes, I think so. Just got a bit dizzy there. My arthritis medication sometimes affects my balance. Tyson nodded with understanding. My father had arthritis in his later years. He used to say that the pain was nothing compared to how people looked at him when he needed his walking stick, made him feel invisible sometimes. The simple acknowledgement of shared experience seemed to steady Barnaby immediately. Here was someone who understood not just the physical challenges of aging, but the emotional impact of being treated as less than human because of those challenges. That's exactly right, Barnaby said, his voice gaining strength. People see the stick and think you're not quite complete anymore. Well, you seem pretty complete to me, sir, Tyson replied with a genuine smile. Can I help you to the lavatory? I promise not to let anyone give you any trouble on the way. As Tyson gently assisted Barnaby to his feet and began to accompany him down the aisle, Lysander watched in growing agitation. The scene unfolding before him was everything he was not. Genuine kindness offered without expectation of reward, strength used to protect rather than intimidate, wealth of character rather than bank balance. But what truly unnerved Lysander was the way the other passengers were responding to Tyson's actions. The young mother, Seraphina, was wiping tears from her eyes as she watched the gentle giant help the elderly man. Other passengers were smiling, some reaching out to touch Tyson's arm as he passed, offering words of appreciation for his kindness. This was the respect and admiration that Lysander had always believed his money would automatically command, but here it was being freely given to someone whose only qualification was basic human decency. When Tyson returned with Barnaby safely back to his seat, Lysander could no longer contain himself. Very touching, he said with venomous sarcasm. I suppose you think you're some sort of hero now, helping one pensioner to the toilet. What's next? Are you going to read stories to the children and help the flight attendant serve drinks? Tyson turned to face Lysander, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was something in his expression that suggested the conversation was about to take a more serious turn. You know what, mate? Tyson said, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. I think you're right. I think you figured something out that I hadn't fully realized myself. Lysander blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting agreement. I am trying to be heroic, Tyson continued, but not for the reasons you think. See, I grew up watching people like Mr. Crumpwell get treated exactly the way you just treated him. Watch my own family get looked down on by people who thought their money made them better than everyone else. Tyson moved closer, not threateningly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. And you're absolutely right about something else too. I probably will help the flight attendant if she needs it, and I'd be happy to read to the children if they asked, because that's what decent people do. They help each other, especially when someone's being cruel for no reason other than their own entertainment. The simplicity of the statement seemed to hit Lysander like a physical blow. Here was someone calling him out, not for his wealth or success, but for his fundamental failure as a human being. You think you're teaching me some sort of lesson? Lysander asked, his voice rising dangerously. You think your little display of working-class solidarity means anything to me? Tyson smiled sadly. No, mate. I don't think I'm teaching you anything. I think you already know everything I could tell you. The question is whether you care enough about being a decent person to do something about it. The aircraft hummed quietly through the afternoon sky as Lysander Pemberton stood in the aisle, facing a man who had just delivered the most devastating critique of his character he had ever received. But what made Tyson's words so powerful wasn't their anger or aggression. It was their quiet certainty, their assumption that somewhere beneath the layers of wealth and privilege there was still a human being capable of recognizing his own moral failings. For a long moment, Lysander said nothing. He stood there in his $3,000 trousers, staring at this working-class giant who had somehow managed to strip away every defense, every justification, every rationalization he had built around his behavior. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone in the cabin. Then, in a voice so quiet that passengers had to strain to hear it, Lysander spoke. You don't know anything about me, he said, but the words lacked conviction. They sounded like the last refuge of someone who was running out of arguments with himself. You're right, Tyson agreed. I don't know your story. I don't know what made you think it was acceptable to treat people the way you've been treating them today, but I know what I've seen, and I know that whatever pain or anger you're carrying around doesn't give you the right to inflict it on innocent people. Lysander's face went through a series of expressions: anger, confusion, something that might have been shame. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller somehow. My grandfather, he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as everyone else. My grandfather spent his last 3 years in a care home, had dementia, couldn't remember anyone's names, couldn't walk without help. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Araminta, who had been discreetly observing from the galley, found herself holding her breath. I was building my first major development project, Lysander continued, his voice growing stronger as the words began to flow. 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I kept telling myself I'd visit him when things calmed down, when the project was finished, when I had more time. Barnaby, despite his own recent humiliation, found himself leaning forward to listen. He died on a Tuesday morning in February. I was in a board meeting arguing about profit margins on luxury flats that were going to make me millions. I didn't even know he was gone until my secretary handed me a note 6 hours later. The transformation in the cabin was remarkable. What had begun as a confrontation between a bully and his challenger had become something else entirely, a moment of unexpected human vulnerability that seemed to touch everyone present. The last conversation I had with him, Lysander said, his voice barely audible now. He kept asking me about my father, about when his son was coming to visit. I got impatient with him because he couldn't remember that my father had died 5 years earlier. I raised my voice, told him to try to focus, to think clearly for once. Serafina felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched this powerful man crumble before them all. The nurse told me later that he cried after I left. This proud man who had built a business from nothing, who had served in the war, who had raised 3 children on his own after my grandmother died, and I made him cry because I couldn't be bothered to show him basic kindness in his final months. Lysander turned to look at Barnaby, who was watching him with an expression of profound understanding. "When I saw you struggling with your walking stick," Lysander said to the elderly gentleman, "for just a moment, you reminded me of him. And instead of feeling sympathy or wanting to help, I felt angry. Angry at you for reminding me of my own guilt. Angry at myself for being the kind of person who could abandon his own grandfather." The honesty of the admission left everyone speechless. This wasn't the calculated apology of a businessman trying to manage a public relations crisis. This was genuine remorse from someone who had just been forced to confront the worst parts of himself. Tyson moved closer to Lysander, but his expression had changed completely. The wariness was gone, replaced by something approaching compassion. "Mate," he said gently, "guilt like that can eat you alive if you let it. But taking it out on other people doesn't make it go away. It just spreads the pain around." Lysander nodded, seemingly unable to speak. Then, with visible effort, he turned to face Barnaby. "Mr. Crumpwell," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened here today. What I said to you was cruel and inexcusable, and it came from my own failings, not from anything you did wrong." Barnaby studied Lysander's face for a moment, then slowly extended his hand. "We all carry regrets, son," he said softly. "The important thing is what we choose to do with them." The handshake between the two men seemed to release something in the cabin's atmosphere. Lysander then turned to Araminta, who was still watching the scene with amazement. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, reading her name tag carefully, "you have been nothing but professional and courteous, despite my unacceptable behavior. You deserved better from me, and I hope you'll accept my sincere apologies." Araminta's professional composure finally cracked, and she smiled genuinely for the first time since Lysander had boarded. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. That means more than you might realize." But Lysander wasn't finished. He moved through the cabin systematically, apologizing to every passenger who had witnessed his earlier behavior. When he reached Serafina and young Crispin, he knelt down to the boy's eye level. "I'm sorry you had to see a grown-up behaving so badly," he said to the child. "Sometimes adults forget how to be kind, but that doesn't make it right." Crispin, with the remarkable forgiveness that children often display, simply nodded and said, "It's okay. My mummy says everyone has bad days sometimes." The simple wisdom of the child's response seemed to affect Lysander more than anything else that had happened. He stood up with tears in his eyes and looked around the cabin at all the people he had wronged. "I don't expect any of you to forget what you've seen today," he said to the cabin at large, "but I hope you might be willing to believe that people can change given the right motivation." As the aircraft began its descent into Manchester, Lysander returned to his seat, but the atmosphere in first class had been completely transformed. Passengers who had earlier avoided eye contact were now engaged in quiet conversations. Araminta moved through the cabin with renewed confidence, and Barnaby was chatting amiably with Serafina about her son's upcoming school play. Tyson, who had started the flight hoping to travel anonymously, found himself in conversation with several passengers who recognized not just his physical presence, but the character he had displayed during the confrontation. But he deflected their praise, insisting that anyone would have done the same thing. As they touched down at Manchester Airport, Lysander approached Tyson one final time. "I need to ask you something," he said. "You could have humiliated me completely back there. You could have made me look like a fool in front of everyone. Why didn't you?" Tyson considered the question seriously before answering. "Because humiliating you wouldn't have helped Mr. Crumpwell or Miss Blackthorne or anyone else on this aircraft. Sometimes the biggest victory isn't crushing your opponent. It's helping them find a way to be better than they thought they could be." Lysander nodded slowly. "I've spent the last 20 years believing that power meant making other people smaller. You've shown me something very different today." "What's that?" "That real strength means making other people feel bigger." As the passengers prepared to disembark, Barnaby approached both men with a smile that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "You know," he said to Lysander, "your grandfather would have been proud of what happened here today. Not the beginning, perhaps, but certainly the ending." Lysander felt something shift inside his chest, a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. "How can you be so sure?" "Because," Barnaby replied, "forgiveness and growth, those are the things that matter to people at the end of their lives. And today, you showed you're capable of both." As they walked off the aircraft together, the three men, a billionaire, a retired teacher, and a world champion, carried with them the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in boardrooms or boxing rings, but in the quiet moments when we choose to be better than our worst impulses. The flight attendant who had witnessed it all stood in the aircraft doorway, watching her passengers disappear into the terminal, knowing she had just experienced something that would change how she thought about human nature for the rest of her career. Sometimes, she reflected, the most profound transformations happen at 35,000 feet, when there's nowhere to run from the truth about who we really are.